Whatever you say nothing when you talk about you know what. For if you know who should hear ya, you know what you'll get. They'll take you off to you know where, and you wouldn't know how long. So for you know whose sake, don't let anyone hear you singing this song. The repeating theme in all of my stories is a cautionary tale. Humans cannot be trusted with complete control over other humans. For instance, I was drafted into an army at the tender age of 5. My kindergarten was a platoon of tiny, uniformed Catholic boys and girls. We were trained by severe women in black and white robes from the Dark Ages. We were taught to obey and believe with one uniform mind. I did not buy it. Their Christ was the paradigm of nonviolence, but if you did not believe in him, they would beat the snot out of you with fists and ruler sticks and lifting you out of your chair by your sideburn hairs. My father ran another army at home, where 7 little Sullivans in 10 years were born. My parents were propagating the Catholic faith under orders from a pope who took it easy on the Nazis, who were exterminating followers of another faith that wasn't even in competition with the Catholics. My father was an NYD policeman, and we were like an experiment to study the effects of police brutality on tiny little white people. Our family motto was, "The beatings will continue until morale improves." After surviving the police brutality of my father's bringing his work home, I sympathized with those suffering the lash of police brutality out in the wider adult world. I don't remember consciously absorbing the details of NYPD-sanctioned torture as a child, but later it rang an alarm bell in my soul when newspaper accounts of illegal police station beatings sounded like the system of discipline practiced at our house. In my teens, I found friends who had songs about fighting back against the cruel bosses in prisons and factories and lashing whip on prison farms. My father belonged to a history of humans abusing their control over other humans without the power to fight back until they stood up to those bastards and called their bluff. Pete Seeger was the first one I remember singing in support of the oppressed and the abused, with such inspiring songs as "Which Side Are You On?" and "Step by Step" from an old Irish song, the Praties. The beatings were relentless until I left home at the age of 18. Our father told us by law we could not leave sooner, as he was responsible for us until then. My brother Richie went into the Army as a second lieutenant from an ROTC program from college. He was sent overseas to Korea, but not before he had a dental exam. "Did you play football in high school, young man?" asked the dentist. "No, sir. Why?" "You have damage consistent with multiple cranial trauma. The roots of your teeth are broken and loose. You're in need of a full denture replacement." My brother was 21. He never played football. But he was beaten by the guy who beat me, our father. Here's a verbatim excerpt from a letter from Richie to me. Like the first time I came home drunk. I was 15 years of age. And he cold-cocked me into the bathtub where I slept overnight. He was told by professionals he had PTSD before he even went into the Army. Many shrinks have told me I had PTSD before I was 13. For as long as I can remember, I have resisted authorities who do not behave according to their own rules. They are bullies masquerading as normal, positive institutions because that's how they were sold to us, as forces for decency, while they raped and brutalized children, protectors of our streets, while they tortured suspects into confessions, abetted by the blue wall of silence. My father was a cop who went to Mass every morning, then came home from work and beat the wife and kids. She was 4'11", and 85 pounds soaking wet in a woolen overcoat, while he tipped the scales at about 220 pounds and stood 6'2". That violence was echoed by the nuns who beat the snot out of us at school, not to mention the sexual abuse carried on and covered up by the silence of all the clergy. How many of the adults of the 50s knew about the abuse, but would not say? There were always whispers, but they trusted these fuckers to keep their children safe. I was just a kid, but I knew something was wrong. Why didn't they say something? Because they were taught to shut up and go along with the program, whatever and wherever it was. Conformity was a big rule then. You didn't question. But in my gut, I just didn't trust them. Just by intuition, all of the adults said nothing. It reminds me of the song by Colum Sands from Northern Ireland, "Whatever you say nothing." There, you can take your life in your hands by saying too much in the wrong neighborhood. Here's the chorus. "Whatever you say nothing. When you talk about you know what. For if you know should hear ya, you know what you'll get. They'll take you off to you know where, and you wouldn't know how long. So for you know's sake, don't let anyone hear you singing that song." For years, I said to myself, don't go along with the norm. It's a trap to make you go along the next time your silence is needed, to swear to their lies. In 1964, people would not believe me when I told them the escalation of our Vietnam conflict into a much larger war was based on an attack that never happened. A U.S. Navy captain, John Herrick, joined by Commander James Stockdale, both serving in Vietnam, concurred. We were about to launch a war under false pretenses, contrary to on-scene military commanders' advice to the contrary. Within days, the Bay of Tonkin Resolution was passed, became law on August 7th, 1964. Lyndon Johnson had all the war power he needed to go full steam ahead, in spite of the ship's captain, John Herrick, telling them it was a false report and he was not attacked. Commander James Stockdale, 1976 Medal of Honor recipient, testified, "I flew over the site many times during the time of the alleged attack. Our destroyers were firing at phantom targets, and there was nothing there but black water and American firepower." The Bay of Tonkin was our 20th century equivalent of the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor that ignited the Spanish-American War, April 21, 1898. In both cases, using questionable evidence, the Congress just went along with the lie and gave the president the power to execute war. People have an inclination not to question power, frequently against their own best interest. They will not speak out. Whatever you say nothing when you talk about you know what. For if you know should hear ya, you know what you'll get. They'll take you off to you know where, and you wouldn't know how long. So for you know who's sake, don't let anyone hear you singing this song. The West Village Green Pool. 30 years ago, on the east end of Long Island, we used to enjoy wide open vistas of farm fields. One of my favorites was Scuttle Hole Road in Bridgehampton, but it's now clustered with clump after clump of cookie-cutter housing, sprouting up like basement mushrooms. They grow where potato fields once grew, as if the temmock that remained was the perfect petri dish to grow houses. The first developer to discover this fertility of potato fields for growing houses was Abe Levitt, who planted Levittown. And he added houses for 50,000 more new suburbanites in Hicksville in 1950. This is the setting for our story. 1950, the Hicksville-Levittown border. Here's a shot of a hot day in July with my contemporaries. From left to right, Stevie Zimmer, Eddie Hammer, my brother Pete, and I. At the age of 5, I realized my mom could not tie me up very well. She tied me up in my snowsuit with a piece of rope to the clothesline in our backyard. There was little threat of being eaten alive outside by wildlife, as lions and tigers and bears were unknown in suburban Levittown. Why does my mom tie me up all the time? Maybe I'll go play with Eddie Hammer. I daydreamed. Within minutes, I had undone her granny knots about my waist and left my backyard for the great unknown through the hole in my neighbor's privet hedge. In their backyard was my best friend Eddie, playing in his wooden sandbox. His blonde hair just a few shades lighter than the light brown sand he was playing in. "Hey, Eddie, what you doing?" I asked. "Digging for gold?" "Yeah, right. Have you been over to the pool?" They were building a public Olympic-sized swimming pool right across the street, about 300 feet up a short hill away from my house. First, we had to break one of those rules that even perfect boys and girls get spanked for: crossing the street without a grown-up. They would completely lose it if they found us doing that without them. As if we didn't know how to cross the street. We were 5 years old. Sheesh. Eddie and I agreed we needed to see what the new pool looked like. Since they poured the cement that week, across the street and up the hill we went to see our pool. It glowed light blue, lighter than the sky. It hurt our eyes to look at so much blue. I stood on the pool's edge, staring into the 12-foot deep section, where the diving board soon would be. The workers had left beer cans and broken bottles on the floor of the pool, near the drain. There were tiny pools of stale beer remains. I was wondering why when I felt the unexpected. Maybe Eddie was just playfully testing me, but when he touched my back, my center of balance went forward and I went with it, tumbling down the slope, sliding and scraping every inch of my 5-year-old skin not covered by my snowsuit. bruising every joint, slammed on my chaotic slipping and flipping into this 12-foot deep cement canyon. The smell down there was sweet and sour, the stale beer soaking into my snowsuit. I must have smelled like an old barroom floor. By the look on Eddie's puss in this picture, I'm reconsidering my assuming he was innocent in this accident. All Eddie said was, "I'll go get Billy." That sounded like good news, as Billy was his older brother, and Eddie would get into trouble if he told his parents. Billy came back with him, and he had an idea. Instead of climbing down to get me, he decided to throw a rope he brought along for the job. I was still dizzy, and I grabbed for it, and as I wrapped it around my hands, Billy heaved me up through the broken bottles and beer cans and up the sloping cement wall. There was a ledge 3 feet down from the top of the pool, about 8 inches wide, that Billy jumped down to when he finished hauling me up to it. He could have walked down that cement slope instead of dragging me up. Billy was big enough, though, at 10 years old, to carry me down the hill to my house and place me in the vestibule. He knocked on the door and ran. My mother opened the door and howled. Seeing her 5-year-old son, who was last seen tied up to the clothesline, in her vestibule, covered in blood and cement dust. The whole neighborhood heard that howl. I remember the visit to the doctor, only because when I left that office, I was covered in so much petroleum jelly, I could have slid all the way home. 20 years later, in a college production of Hamlet, I had a speech as the prince at Ophelia's graveside. Alas, poor York. The director had me standing on a mezzanine level about 12 feet above the main stage, awaiting Laertes' entrance. I didn't mind standing over a 12-foot drop, delivering my lines without a book, but the director made a blocking change. I was surprised by the gravedigger trying to slip behind me with a 12-foot deep grave below. "Oh, no way," I heard myself say. "What the fuck are you doing, Charlie?" "I told him to go there," came the director's voice from the darkened seats down front. I grabbed the nearest stable piece of the stage and said, "Well, please untell him, because this really freaks me out. I could fall from up here, and I'll grab Charlie on the way down. You can kill actors and nobody'll mind. But if you kill Charlie, who will fix the theater speakers or our stage lighting?" Charlie doubled as our stagehand gravedigger. I'm sure the resourceful Mr. Shakespeare would have approved. We tried a number of ways to rehearse the scene, but with someone behind me while I faced a 12-foot drop, I could not speak a line. I felt like Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners, stammering, hamina, but nothing close to my assigned Shakespearean lines. Stuck behind my fear of a ghost that wasn't written into the script, Eddie Hammer haunted that play until the director found another way for the gravedigger to enter laughing. Lend a friend a hand. I have always reacted like it was my job to resist bullies, large or small, in words or deeds, even when I was a young punk myself, an apprentice bully. At the age of 12, I was trying to sweet talk a next-door neighbor. We shared our first kiss when we were 7. Puppy love, blooming in the suburbs. She had moved away for years and returned transformed into a graceful, modest beauty with fine, honey-colored hair and inviting, easy blue eyes that had me gobsmacked. We were hanging around a public swimming pool in the warmth of a 1950s summer when a mutual friend, Lenny, walked up and asked me to defend him against a kid who was picking on him. As I was an apprentice suburban drugstore cowboy, I spent a lot of time hanging around the public pool and the drugstore, practicing how to look as tough as the other punks I hung around with. So I couldn't turn down this request. I excused myself from my young lady friend, as if I had some minor errand to run, like stopping some desperados from sticking up the noon stagecoach. Then I'd be right back. I saw the kid Lenny was pointing to. I figured I'd just walk over, tell him to cool it, and I could walk away acting like a tough guy and getting back to begging for affection. I forgot. It was summertime, and all I had on was a black nylon bathing suit and a t-shirt. The uniform for the teenage guys I hung around with at the pool. Although I was a foot taller than this kid, he could see I was clearly what my mother called a skinny malink and a tall drink of water. I undoubtedly weighed less than he did. I was 5'8", but tipped the scales at 118 pounds, fully dressed in a wet woolen overcoat. This other kid was short, but built like a fire plug. And when I told him not to pick on my friend, I found out he had a disposition like a fire plug, too. "Oh, yeah? What are you going to do about it?" the fire plug said. "I'll kick your ass." This was not going well. Didn't he get the picture? This is my neighborhood. Obviously, I was not getting the picture. And this well-meaning anti-bully campaign was going up in smoke. But I felt like I couldn't help myself. In for a dime, in for a dollar. Meanwhile, the fire plug had 2 or 3 cronies egging us on. Then somebody shoved me in his direction, and he grabbed me like he was a little spider in some kind of wrestling hold that I didn't have strength to get out of. As we fell to the ground, my arms were trapped under me, and his elbow was pressing into my throat. So much I could hardly say uncle. We squirmed about in the grass and pine needles until I got a free hand to push his elbow away. And as I saw this was not getting any better, I said, Okay, I give. I found out later he was on the wrestling team and his father was the coach. Ouch. My knees were green with grass stain. My shoulders and my back rubbed red and brown with dirt and striped with streaks of pine needles. But the real damage was my black mood, my crippled teenage pride. But it got worse. When I walked back to the bench where I left my young lady friend, she had vanished. And so had Lenny. I walked past the bench and through the gate to the pool and jumped into the pool's cool blue universe. I swam around forever, stunned, trying not to think. My youthful foolishness that day made me hot with shame, and it burns in me still, in the form of my Irish temper. I must warn you and I, this self-righteous rage may turn on us like the appetite that grows on what it feeds. But I will still take up arms against all bullies, great and small, while fighting the impulse to be a bully myself. When that fire plug moment reoccurs to me more than 60 years later, it reminds me, don't write no check with your mouth that your ass can't cash. The panoramic view of my stories is through the tumult of a dark gray and green cumulus nimbus column, tumbling mile high. But there are linings of sunshine that stretch from the past to my present day optimism as a survivor. I share my life with my wife, another survivor of an interesting childhood. She makes her living with her gardening business when she's not toiling in her studio, making art, recycling miraculous detritus from the woods and beaches that surround us. They are blended with artifacts honoring the integrity of 19th century manufacturing and abandoned relics of domestic crafts in lace and bone. We share a house we bought in Sag Harbor when it was still known as a sleepy fishing village or a drinking town with a fishing problem. Here's the addition that adds 2 studios to our house, financed by the money I made working as a loft tenant activist, because our landlords paid us a tidy sum for moving out of our Soho loft many years after the loft law passed. Imagine getting paid for tenant activism. Well, that's how it worked out. Considering the interesting childhood I had, I insisted on resisting relentlessly any force trying to control me. If a life well lived is the best revenge, I got my revenge by carving out a creative, satisfied life, in spite of those who would deny me. This is what victory looks like to a survivor. My life flows on in endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the real, though far off hymn that hails a new creation. Above the tumult and the strife, I hear its music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? Whatever you say nothing when you talk about you know what. For if you know should hear you, you know what you'll get. They'll take you off to you know where, and you wouldn't know how long. So for you know whose sake, don't let anyone hear you singing this song.